So I just got home, and by the looks of things, I'd say it's time to build a new computer. Alright, so this is really exciting. I'm about to build a brand new retro computer using the parts behind me to serve as a benchmarking platform for my PCI Express cards. This is all the more exciting because this entire PC was actually a donation to the channel thanks to a community called Day One Patch. It's a community I've been a member of for a long time. I reached out to the members there and explained that I actually needed a new benchmarking platform for an upcoming project, and generously they donated all of the necessary money to make this system happen. Specifically, two members, Wade and Solly, they basically contributed all the money. Again, I can't thank you guys enough. It just really means a lot that there's actually people out there who are willing to contribute to my projects and help make all of the things that I'm trying to do a reality. So if you want to skip straight to the build, just click the time code down at the bottom in the description. But first, a little background about this system and why I chose its parts. So this PC is going to be another Windows XP platform. So while I already have another Windows XP system, and a very capable one, which supports both AGP and PCI Express cards, and you can check out the motherboard up there in the card there in the corner, I found out with some of my tests that it just isn't fast enough for most of my PCI Express cards. The goal of Pixel Pipes isn't necessarily to build a retro system with era-appropriate parts from top to bottom. It's all about the graphics cards and pairing the cards up with CPUs that are newer and or more powerful than what was available when they first launched in initial reviews. This, in combination with more mature drivers, may help us get a better understanding of their performance and their true competitive standing, and ultimately maybe learn something new about them. This is especially important because over the past year I've been working on a massive new project called the GPU History Project, and it's something I mentioned in past videos as well. This gigantic project is going to cover graphics cards over the course of 6 years, starting from the very first GPU on up to the last fixed pipe architectures. The goal is to see the growth of the GPU from its earliest incarnation to the end of an era right before we see the start of DirectX 10 cards and unified shader architectures. The original intent was to use my Windows XP test platform as just one centralized platform for all the graphics cards in the test. Even though the Athlon 64 X2 is overclocked, it's a 2005 era CPU. It's more than enough for my AGP cards, which top out at the 9800 Pro. But it just isn't fast enough to really show the true potential performance of my PCI Express cards, and thusly fulfill one of the fundamental goals of this channel, which is to show their true performance with an overpowered CPU. So I had to make a difficult decision to split the project into two separate platforms. And so while they wouldn't be perfectly mirrored, it would show better scaling from the earliest AGP cards all the way up to the last PCI Express cards going into 2006. So to that end, let's get into the part selection. So at the heart of the platform is an LGA 775 system using a Core 2 generation processor, specifically the fastest dual core variant that Intel put out, the Q8600 here. This runs at 3.33 gigahertz at stock and uses a 1333 front side bus on a 45 nanometer process with 6 megs of L2 cache. And to power it, I'm using this as a platform. This is the Asus P5K-E based on the P35 chipset. And I actually got pretty lucky with this board. This I found for $40 and actually included a Q6600 and a couple of gigs of some very basic DDR2 memory. They did make a newer chipset, a couple more advanced chipsets for this platform for LGA 775. So there was the P45 chipset, which supposedly it was better at overclocking. It supported higher FSBs a little better, so those tend to go for kind of expensive on eBay. You can expect for a really good overclocking board to go $400 plus. So I've felt pretty fortunate to find this one for a good deal. One of the reasons I went with a Core 2 platform is that in relative terms it is fairly inexpensive, especially for the price I paid. This processor was only $13, and it's a very, very good overclocker. This chip is known to get well over 4 gigahertz. This was a very fast platform too, by 2008 standards. And this gives me some scalability. Not only can I use PCI Express cards starting from 2004 with the 16 pipe cards, but I can go all the way up to 2006, 2007, early DirectX 10 cards, no problem. You know, probably even 2008 cards too, and still be relatively free from major bottlenecking issues. All right, and next we have the RAM. Now this is 2 gigs of OCZ PC2 8500, obviously DDR2 memory, which we have to use with this platform. This runs at DDR2 1066 speeds. And I don't need more than 2 gigs of RAM. Again, remember we're running Windows XP 32-bit, and I'm trying to keep the system somewhat similar to each other between the Athlon 64 test bed and this one. And this wasn't even my first choice for memory. I actually had initially purchased some Crucial Ballistics Tracers RAM, which was spec'd identically to this, and it was sent to the wrong person. With the refund, I was able to purchase another part that I needed, but this RAM is spec'd identically to those, and it looks a little bit slicker as well. All right, and for cooling, we have the classic Cooler Master Hyper 212 X Turbo, which is the dual fan version here. So hopefully this will get me up to good overclock. We'll see, but for the money, there are a few coolers that can beat this. Then for storage, we have the Samsung 830 series 128 gig SSD. This is the same drive that I'm using in the other Windows XP build. It's inexpensive, it's only $50. There's no technical reason why the drives need to be identical between them. It won't help with performance during benchmarking or anything else, except that it will load games really fast. It does make the benchmarking process a lot smoother. These drives absolutely fly in Windows XP build, and I kind of just like the symmetry of having the same drive in both builds. All right, and the power supply is a Corsair CX650M. This was a refurbished drive on Newegg. It was only $50. It is a semi-modular power supply, so for the most part, I'll be able to pick and choose the cables that I need. And of course, you can't forget about sound. This is a Windows XP system, so you have to use a Sound Blaster Audigy-based card. This is an Audigy 2 ZS. Again, this is the same, this is another part where I'm using the exact same one between both XP platforms. So I just wanted to keep the builds, again, as similar as possible. And last but not least, we have the fans, the SATA cables in white to match the case. And of course, we need an optical drive when using Windows XP and some thermal paste. And for the case, I went with a Fractal Design Focus G in white. This is a $59 case, and there's certainly other cases available for the price. In fact, Hardware Canucks did a review recently of a case from Fantex, which is in the same price range, and actually includes a number of features that this case doesn't. You do kind of have to compromise the few things with a case of this price. I mean, it still has the Fractal Design general quality, but you lose things like a power supply shroud or rubber grommets for the cable routing holes. Now, the case from Fantex actually does include a power supply shroud But one thing it doesn't have that this case does is actually an optical drive bay, 2 of them specifically. And for the most part, if you're building a modern rig, you're not going to need those, but this is an XP build, and we definitely have to have an optical drive with this system. But I still wanted to give it kind of a modern look and feel, and when it's all put together, I think it's going to look pretty sharp. So without any further ado, what do you say we get to the build? Alright, moment of truth. The cooler acted as though it wasn't even compatible with 775, even though on the product page it said it was. So it It was a little awkward getting it on. It was kind of an odd fit. Some of the screws went in at an angle, but let's hit the power button. We have life. Alright, so it's day 2, and I ran into a major snag. I was spending all day yesterday building and then testing the system, and I was going to start filming a section about overclocking when, while testing at stock, the system just died around midnight last night. And when I say die, like, nothing happens when you press the power button, but the light on the motherboard indicating that there is power turns on. So it's probably either the motherboard or the CPU that's given out. Hopefully it's just the CPU, because that would be the cheaper component to replace with the motherboard. I got a good deal on this one, and to replace it would be a lot more expensive. So this starts the process of ripping apart the system I just built and trying to find the cause of the issue. So I swapped out the CPU for the Q6600 and switched to a different cooler, which is a little bit more compatible with 775 socket. Tried switching out the RAM, switched out the graphics card. Nothing seemed to work, so the last thing to try out was the power supply. And I ripped out the Corsair power supply from my main system, and it works. That loud noise is the X850 XT when it first boots up. So yeah, I had to reset the CMOS as another method of troubleshooting it, so that's complaining about the CMOS being reset. And the Q6600 is still in there, but I mean, it's alive again. So this power supply that I got for a good deal on Newegg was a refurbished power supply, and it worked for a day, basically, or less than a day, before, clocking out. And the good news is that since it's a Newegg purchase, I can just RMA it. I've already submitted it. So now I'm debating if I should just put this power supply back in my main system or just use this computer, because it's a retro computer and I want to use a retro computer. Probably not going to do that, but it is kind of unfortunate, because that does mean that I have to return this, wait for the refund, buy another power supply, which I hope I can still get a modular one for the money, but that will delay this whole thing another week easy. So yeah, bit of a bummer. I've already waited 2 weeks for this build. Alright, so I just got the new power supply in to replace the Corsair CX650M that broke, and I replaced it with an EVGA 650B3, which with the mail-in rebate was actually the same price. This is actually a fully modular power supply. I'm not really sure which one is really better in the end, but I think the base price for this one is higher. But hey, if it works, then it's already better. So I'm gonna hurry up and put this one in. But before I install the new power supply, I'm gonna make things interesting. I'm going to install that heatsink in the new retro system. This is my main desktop computer. It's almost old enough to be a retro system in its own right. It's a 2010 era PC, Phenom 2 X6 1090T. I don't even overclock it. It's running at the stock 3.2 gigahertz, and so I don't really need this giant heatsink on here. At one time I did overclock it. I got it up to 3.9 gigahertz, but the motherboard started kind of flaking out, so I just backed it down to stock, and that's how I've been using it. The Hyper 212X is not really LGA 775 compatible. It said on Newegg that it was, but on Cooler Master's website, it confirmed that it is not. And when I tried to install it on here, I had to put the screws in at an angle, which is a little more janky than I would like. It still performed okay. I mean, it cooled all right. I was able to do some overclocking testing before this power supply died. This cooler, I know, is LGA 775 compatible. Matter of fact, I even have a conversion kit that I got a while back for LGA 1156, and this one has the LGA 775 holes in the retention brackets and whatnot. I'll be using that. Of course, the Hyper 212X is fully AM2 Plus compatible, so I think both CPUs in the end will be served better by swapping out the coolers, and we're gonna go from there and see what it does. And here's the finished build, finally. Got the new cooler installed, obviously. New, old. And the new power supply, which is working just fine. Already went through a slew of tests, installed a bunch of games and everything. One thing I do have to say, the fully modular design is actually not necessarily the best if you don't have a power supply shroud. You end up with much wider cables at the terminations going into the power supply, whereas if it were semi-modular, the main ATX motherboard connectors would come out of a hole about that big and be pushed all the way to the back of the case, and you wouldn't hardly see it. Here it's just kind of this I don't know, grotesque mess of wires there. I may go into more details about it later. Well, actually, I'll talk about it right now. Working in this case, this is a good case. So again, this is the Fractal Design Focus G, and you know, it's decent. It's a budget case, so you know, what can you expect for $60? Features wise, there are some cases that offer better things in terms of cable management. I needed the optical drive bay, and so there's not a lot of high quality cases in this price range that have that as well. This has lots of fan options here. The really cool thing is that the motherboard I'm using has just enough fan headers on it. It can power all 5 fans from the motherboard, so I don't have to use extra cables coming out of the power supply just to run the fans. That works really well. 2 40s that come with the case, and then 2 that were added in the top, and then a 120 in the back, so there's a lot of airflow. You can even add a fan down here at the bottom for some extra intake, which I was tempted to do, but with all the cables kind of sitting there, it'd be a little bit of a mess. I might have some interference with the fan blades. But this case has one kind of glaring issue with it, which is that between the back side panel and the motherboard tray, there's hardly any space. So it gives you all the necessary holes to route the cables, but then you have this very, very narrow space to try to fit the 24-pin connector and the 8-pin connector and every other cable that you're trying to hide. So literally what you're having to do when you put on the back side panels, you're pushing up against it and trying to squeeze it in. And so basically it's just kind of crushed back there. It's enough to close it, but it's very little space. And you can see they do have a slight raised indentation here, which helps small amount, but it is very little there. You can see, unfortunately, I don't have an I/O shield for this board, but that's all right. Now, I do like that at the bottom of the case here. I'm going to tip it up just a little bit if I can. Okay, so here at the bottom of the case, you can sort of see that there is a removable mesh here, which is nice. It's a little dust filter. There's no magnetic meshes here, so they're all just held on by little metal tabs. And at the top, it comes with dust filters as well, which have to be inserted between the fan and the case here. That can be very, very fiddly trying to line up all 4 holes on both sides. It was actually very tricky to get these top fans installed. And because I had to replace the power supply, I was trying to route the 8-pin connector, which is up in the top corner there of the motherboard, which you can't hardly see it. It's way tucked in there. In order to fit that through there without having to remove everything inside of it was an extreme hassle. I unscrewed the fans, but then the fans wouldn't actually come out because they're pinned by the cooler. So I probably should have just removed the cooler, but I had to do things my way, I guess. And at the front here, the 2 fans that are included, it's actually enough space that if I wanted to, I could put a 280mm radiator in here. And actually, Cooler Master makes one that is LGA 775 compatible. It's relatively inexpensive, and it should actually cool a bit better than this cooler here. This cooler is actually not much better in terms of performance than the Hyper 212X Turbo that it is replacing, but this fits better on the socket, so I think it's just a safer bet to have in the long run. But it is nice to have all this space here in the front. If I wanted to expand with an all-in-one water cooler, I could do that. So I'll get some better close-ups a little bit later with the lights dimmed and everything. But for now, let's talk about overclocking. Alright, so overclocking. Yeah, so this is actually the first Core 2 generation system I've ever messed with. And I did some research beforehand about how to overclock this generation of chips. And it's pretty traditional. It's using a traditional old style front side bus. So you have to, you overclock that. You have to keep in mind the speed of your memory and the speed of the North Bridge as well. So in some ways it's less complicated than overclocking a newer processor via the base clock speed, because you're not worried about, like say for instance, in the case of Athlon 64, you're not worried about the hypertransport speed as a separate multiplier in addition to the RAM divider. And in that sense, it's a little less to worry about. It's going back to the roots of overclocking with, the old Athlon XPs and the Pentium 4s that I'm familiar with. So basically my approach to this was to down the multiplier as much as possible. The max multiplier on this processor, the E8600, is 10. So I brought it down to 6, and then went up gradually on the front side bus by about 25 megahertz or so. It starts at 333, so I boosted it 22 the first time, and then 25 megahertz each time after that. And my goal was really to hit about 450. I did briefly try to go above that, but I didn't really stick with it. And gradually, though, it did eventually get to my goal of 450. Now, if you remember in the parts introduction video portion of the video, I mentioned that the newer version of the chipset that I'm using, which is the P35 right now, the newer version, the P45, supposedly has a reputation as having a better overclocking headroom with the front side bus. However, this board is no slouch. I mean, I've had this thing all the way up to 475 before it was acting kind of quirky, but it still booted into Windows just fine. So at the end of the day, I settled on, I brought the multiplier up gradually as well once I found the highest front side bus, and it did go all the way up to the max 10, so that netted me a speed of 4.5 gigahertz. Again, I briefly tried a little bit more. I tried it at 4.6 gigahertz and it was benchable. Now, if you think that sounds really impressive, do keep in mind that there's a couple of factors here. One, I'm not going for a Prime 95 stable overclock. I don't need it to be 100% perfect, because I'm not doing really sensitive, heavy-duty computing on this. It just has to be benchable. That was my only goal. My Athlon 64 rig is also not Prime 95 perfect. And the other thing to keep in mind is that I'm also running a 32-bit operating system, in particular Windows XP, which is not as strenuous on the CPU. It's much easier to reach a higher overclock in a 32-bit OS, especially with XP. So for those curious, the RAM is running 1-to-1 with that front side bus, so it's running about 900 megahertz. It's rated for 1066, so that's fairly easy for the RAM to do. And the CPU voltage is set at 1.36, 1.365, which in actual real-world terms actually ends up at 1.34 volts. So it's a fairly comfortable setting there. It's not really crazy high. Again, I do have a fairly decent cooler on here. The temps don't get too crazy either. At most, it was hitting about 71 or so. So in terms of benchmarks, what does a 4.5 gigahertz Core 2 Duo net me in terms of the benchmark results, especially in cases like 3D Mark 2001, where CPU bottlenecking matters on a lot of the newer graphics cards, at least the PCI Express graphics cards that I'll be using this system for. And the fact of the matter is that with the graphics card that I have in here right now, the 8800 GTX, 3D Mark 2001, for example, does just about twice the score as in my Athlon 64 rig, which isn't a surprise to me. I knew that the Athlon 64 was heavily bottlenecking the 8800 GTX, but this is a dramatic gain. And even in other benchmarks that I thought were a lot more GPU dependent, such as 3D Mark 05 and Doom 3 and so on, there's still a dramatic improvement. So just in all aspects, at least with the 8800 GTX that I've tried in here so far, I'm seeing huge gains in performance. We haven't eradicated bottlenecking altogether. For that, I would probably need a fairly fast system by modern standards, in which case that would just end up being my desktop computer. But for now, the issue of bottlenecking is greatly alleviated, and that will help tons when it comes to the graphics card history project that I'm working on, to really show the scaling of performance from the very first GPU, again, to the very last fixed function architectures. Obviously that won't include the 8800 GTX, but this is still a good system to use the 8800 in if I should do future videos based on the early DirectX 10 cards, because there's a lot to say, not just about the 8800 series, which was groundbreaking at the time. There's a lot to say about other cards from ATI too. So there's a lot that is opened up to me now with this new system. So with all that out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and end this video with some attempts at glamour shots with this system. Keep in mind, I don't have a professional camera rig, so I'm just going to do my best and leave you with that.